All right, my name is Keith Hare. Among other things, I am the convener of ISO IEC JTC1 C32 WG3, which is the international committee responsible for database languages. And I'm going to do a brief talk about the property graph standards, the process and timing, and a little bit about where we are in the process. So talk about the process and then what's going on, and a couple of people later we'll give more details. But first, I rattled off a string of letters and numbers, and if you've been around the process for a while, they begin to sound familiar. But this is a translation, and you can paste this on your wall for when you need to understand what's going on. There's a joint technical committee under ISO, which is the International Organization for Standardization, and under IEC, the International Electrotechnical Commission. And it is called JTC1, or Joint Technical Committee 1. The names aren't all that fancy. Under JTC1 is Subcommittee 32, which is responsible for a number of standards around data management and interchange. Within within SC32 is Working Group 3, which is responsible for the database languages standards. Historically, this was SQL. In recent years, it is also the property graph database language, GQL. So here's a picture of the hierarchy. Here's a graph of the hierarchy. But at the JTC1 level, international ballots take place. They're at the SC32 level. There's more of the bureaucratic stuff, and the work really happens at the working group level. And that's what I'm this week, last week, and next week, and the weekend in between, I am in Berlin for a WG3 meeting. I'll talk a little more about that later. Within the process, there are a number of steps, and I'll rattle off particularly committee draft and draft international standard, DIS, so CD and DIS, because those are important steps, and we're right in the middle of that at the moment. The workflow diagram for the process is you start off working on a project. You decide that it's ready for a committee draft ballot. You get a bunch of comments. You resolve those comments, and when you're ready, when the committee is ready, you do a DIS ballot. And eventually, there might be what's called a final DIS ballot, and you end up with an international standard. In WG3, we have individual experts from a number of national bodies, and including China, Denmark, Finland, Germany, Japan, Korea, the Netherlands, Sweden, United Kingdom, and the United States. I'll leave this slide for you to look at later. This is sort of a breakdown of who participates from each of the national bodies. And it's probably out of date at this point because I haven't double checked it in 6 months. In the US, there is a sort of mirror committees that mirror the structure in the International Committee. And you might have heard in the past me talk about DM32 as the US committee for reasons that aren't worth going into. INCITS changed the names of committees, and what had been DM32 is now data management. So every once in a while, we change the names just to confuse the participants. Anyhow, under data management, there are a number of expert groups that are working on specific tasks. The ones we're interested in today are SQL, PGQ, and GQL, but there's also some work on streaming that should be really interesting in sometime soon. The players in the US, I've broken down by my perception of what the primary interest is. And from a standards development standpoint, if you look at the number of players that are mostly interested in GQL, we have added a number of participants to the standards process in recent years, primarily because of the property graph work that we're doing. Work in DM32 or data management is primarily going on in a couple of expert groups. One for SQL PGQ, property graph queries in SQL, one for GQL. And we've been meeting for a number of years on 2-hour meetings on Tuesdays of alternate weeks, discussing papers, doing technical work, and eventually submitting papers to WG3. In SC32 WG3, looks like I lost the 3 on the title on this slide. In the past, we had done about usually three face-to-face meetings a year. 2 years ago, face-to-face meetings suddenly went out of style for some reason. And so we've been working on web conferences. One of the fun things about doing web conferences with an international committee is that there is no good common time. And so we've been doing monthly web conferences and offsetting the start time by about 8 hours every month. So you do the math and you'll see that there are occasions when somebody is meeting at midnight. But we have been using the web conferences to continue to get work done. As I said, this week, we actually have a meeting in Berlin. We have 8 or 9 people in the room. It's varied a little bit for a couple of reasons, but we also have a web conference aspect, so it's a hybrid meeting. And we've had participants from China, Korea, Japan, the US, and various places in Europe. One of the things about WG3 is that we operate based on written proposals. And this has some advantages for a number of reasons. By the time you write something down, it's either understandable or it's still confusing, but at least you can argue about what it actually means. And so we have concrete change proposals. WG3 makes the final decisions about what goes into the standard. We record fairly decent minutes. And one of the advantages of having change proposals documents is, and details in the minutes, is that we can go back in 5 years or in 10 years or sometimes even longer and see what the logic was for doing something. And sometimes we find that the logic was mistaken in the first place and that something needs to be fixed. Other times it gives us an explanation of what's going on. We have editors who apply the papers that we approve to the draft documents. We also have some liaison relationships. You guys might have heard of an organization called LDBC, the Linked Data Benchmark Council. And over the last couple of years, that's been more active and less active. Among other things, we've produced a couple of papers. The one that George is going to talk about in a bit, PG keys, and one that was presented this week at SIGMOD on the graph pattern matching in GQL and SQL PGQ. And from my point of view, the LDBC relationship is valuable because it gets more eyes looking at things and more thoughts into the process, and generates more academic papers that are useful for explaining the details of what it is we're doing and why. We also have a relationship with OGC. That hasn't been particularly active in the last year. I see that as becoming more important in future versions as we look at adding support for spatial to GQL. Version 2 or later, probably later, because there's still a lot of work to be done. Brief history of the standard. We've had a lot of versions. We're currently finishing up a new version of multiple parts of the SQL standard, including a new part called SQL PGQ, Property Graph Queries in SQL. GQL, the project was formally initiated in September 2019. So we're 3 years into it. We're making progress. And I'll talk a little more about that later. But GQL is a full database language with create, read, update, delete, transactions, and schema. Quick comparison of PGQ and GQL. The idea of PGQ is that you can build property graph views on top of SQL tables and have property graph queries using a graph pattern matching language that returns data from the property graph views. From my point of view, this is important because there's a fair amount of data in the world that is in SQL tables, and that isn't likely to change. But this gives you the power of property graphs on top of existing data. GQL is a full database language. The graph pattern matching language in GQL is identical to the graph pattern matching language in PGQ. So if you learn how the graph pattern matching language for PGQ, then you're ready to do, with a little bit more knowledge, you're ready to do queries in a GQL database. I mentioned the idea of a committee draft ballot. We had one of those that closed in last February. The comments in a ballot like this, the comments are actually more important than the ballot results. We have a number of different levels of seriousness of comments, major technical, minor technical, editorial, and in this case, we had 93 language opportunities. So the editors will resolve most of the editorial comments, which is about 31% between major and minor. The language opportunities, there's a few of them that we will take, but what language opportunities are good ideas. In a lot of cases, they're good ideas for a future version, not for this version. If we tried to do all of the good ideas that we know about, we would probably take us another 10 years, and that would defeat the purpose of writing the standard. Some of these were possible problems that we knew about before the GQL CD ballot, but still a fair amount of comments. We have been working on resolving the comments. So as of last Sunday, when I updated this, we had resolved 38% of the comments. I decided against updating the slide again this afternoon, but as of now, we have resolved a bit over 50% of the comments. The comments that say, in the yellow, that say no, yes, are comments that have not yet been resolved, but have people who have volunteered to have papers written for that. And so as of last Sunday, we had 16% where we had solutions and 45% where nobody had volunteered for them yet. We have made a lot of progress in the last week, and we'll make a lot of progress in the next, between now and next Friday. So we are resolving comments, but it's still a lot of work to do. So when, you ask, is this all going to be done? For SQL PGQ, the DIS ballot will start in this August and complete at the end of December with the beginning of January. Once the ballot completes, there's a couple more steps, and my best guess is that we'll have a published standard by June of next year. For GQL, our current plan has the DIS ballot starting about the beginning of April, or maybe a week or two early of 2023, which would have it completing in September, and have a published standard in 2024. However, if you happen to be an implementer, one of the things to remember is that draft standards, the technical part of draft standards, are stable by the time the DIS ballot starts. So you can be fairly confident in SQL PGQ by the end of this next week. For GQL, you can be fairly confident by March or April of 2023. So standards are an iterative process. They're actually fairly collaborative, and we spend a lot of time working together. There's some amount of standards bureaucracy, which can be tedious at times, and some of this ends up being compromised between different experts working for different companies. But overall, I think the results are actually pretty good. As I said, PGQ is going to be published probably by June, maybe a little bit earlier next year. GQL should be published by March of 2024, possibly a little bit earlier. However, because the graph pattern matching for GQL is identical to graph pattern matching for SQL PGQ, and PGQ is going to be stable by the end of next week, graph pattern matching for GQL will be stable by the end of next week. So if you're looking at this and saying, when can we begin to safely implement, now is the time. All right, that's what I have. I could probably go on for another hour, but I was only allotted 15 minutes. So are there any questions?
Thank you, Keith, for the talk. Questions from the room? Please raise your hand. Peter?
So, Keith, thanks. So, GQL is kind of has been shifted to 2024 now. Can you elaborate a bit on the process regarding GQL? And,
well, the basic process is we had the committee draft ballot. We got 800 comments. We now need to resolve those comments. Some of those comments are, and some of the things are going to result in taking out things that were good ideas but are not yet complete. And it takes time. In this last week, people here in Berlin have written about 40 papers to resolve comments, and we're making progress, but it is slower than I would like. But it takes whatever. Building a standard is actually a lot of work. So as we make progress, I refine the dates.
Okay.
Okay. Any questions, Alistair?
I mean, related question, Keith. When do you think really the technical content of the GQL draft standard will be stable in reality, and we can just ignore all the flim-flam of the ISO process, because the flim-flam is never going to result in anything but a 3-line change from a technical perspective? When does that happen in your
Well,
head?
from a technical perspective, the graph pattern matching is going to be stable by the end of this week, because the graph pattern matching is identical with PGQ, and PGQ will be done this week. The probably the biggest holes at the moment have to do with creating a graph type and making sure that all the rules are in place so that if you have a rigid graph type, that you're prevented from inserting and updating data that would violate the graph type. A lot of it, the rest is making sure that all of the details are worked out.